I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Well, we'll pick up this morning where we were last week. We didn't finish some of the thoughts on this question. We read in Micah 5, in verses 2 to 5. We read in here Micah's prophecy of Christ. And we looked at a couple of things that proved this was Jesus that Micah was speaking of. And I wanted to mention that 2 Samuel 7, if you remember back when we studied Samuel, David connected, 2 Samuel 7, Samuel connects the Messiah with the Davidic house. Remember, that was that prophecy. And we've seen that fulfilled. But Micah here, he's the first one, he's the first prophet to point out the city where Jesus was born. And we looked at that last week in Bethlehem, and we looked at why it said Bethlehem of Ephraim, because there was two Bethlehems, remember? One up in, what tribe was the other one? Zebulon, I think?
It's up north somewhere.
Yeah, it was up north. I think it was Zebulon. Yes, Bethlehem in the tribe of Zebulon, and we read that in Joshua 19. And but here Micah makes the distinction of where Christ was to be born. And there was a couple other things I wanted us to look at. In verse 4 of that, just to help us see that this is the Christ that Micah is speaking of. And our first point to prove that was Bethlehem in Ephraim, where he was born. And the wise men, remember the wise men that went to Herod and had told Herod they were following the star, looking for that. They would have been following this prophecy. They would have been looking to Bethlehem through Micah's prophecy. But also verse 4 makes a few distinctions of who this Micah is speaking of. And he says, he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. If you go to Acts chapter 7 and verse 55, we'll see here something that Stephen saw that kind of helps with our thoughts of standing. In Acts 7 and verse 55, maybe we'll start at the front here with Jeremy first. You read that, Jeremy, please.
But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God.
Okay, just the thought of standing here. Who's Christ standing with God? That shows his deity, right? Remember, that was the point we were trying to make. We had made the point that the Jehovah Witnesses and Islam, neither one of them claim that Christ is deity, and yet these verses show us.
The Jews don't either.
The who?
The Jews don't either.
Oh, right, that's right. Yeah, I should have put them in there too. Yeah, they strip Christ of who he is, and yet they take a lot of the Old Testament and they stand by it, but yet they pick and choose what they want out of there. And so these extra little verses here help us out. So we see here, Christ is standing with God. Stephen witnessed that. And then John 7, Naomi, or did you read that? John 7 verses 27 to 30. 27 to 30.
But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they were seeking to arrest him, and no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come.
Okay, so again, to go along with Stephen's visions, Christ is saying here, you know, I am. He stands with the Father, and he's telling them, you both know me, and where I'm from. And so we see, again, then the proof. The idea of in strength of the Lord is in that verse. In the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord. And John 1, or Matthew 28 and verse 20. Gord, you grab that, please? Yeah, 28 and 20. And Kala, I'll give you Matthew 7 and 29.
Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Okay, and
He was teaching them as one having authority, and not as their scribes.
okay, so here in both those verses we see Christ's authority. He has all authority, and Micah is making that point. And Kala's verse, what was your verse, Kala? I forgot it.
Matthew 7:29.
Right.
She just read it.
The which Gord?
I said she just read it.
Oh, okay, yeah, I know, but I was trying to remember. Oh, right, I was trying to remember the point I wanted for that verse. The fact that they knew, the scribes knew, didn't they? They weren't willing to admit it, but they make the claim themselves. You know, he speaks as one having authority.
In that sermon, he says that this is what you said, this is what I say. And he had it all the way through. And you think about that, the scribes would say, well, this is what the word of the Lord said. This is what the law of Moses said, or this is what the traditions of the elders say. Jesus, who gave him this authority? And the only one who could have given them this authority is God.
Right.
And that goes to make your point that I can't stand up and say this is what the Bible says, but this is what I say. I can't do that.
Right.
I don't have the authority that Christ had.
Right, Jeremy, right, that's a good point. Another thought was for those that would strip Christ of his deity. There's a point here I snuck in, 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 9. And this is it 2 Samuel 7? Yes. Here is what the Lord is saying about David. See, we're always, man leans putting their trust in other men. And there are great men. Okay, and we read here of David, 2 Samuel 7 and 9. Huh? Please.
And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and have made you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth.
Okay, so here we see David being set in the category, it's a great name. He's a great man, and he'll be known as a great man. Okay, and then in 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 15. I'll grab that right away, Lisa, because I have that. And he made, this is speaking of Uzziah and what he had accomplished, and he made devices in Jerusalem, invented by skillful men, to be on the towers and the corners, to shoot arrows and large stones. So his fame, Uzziah's fame, spread far and wide, for he was marvelously helped till he became strong. So again, the thought, God's helping him, of course, but his name would be great among men. He would be known for that. But now of the Messiah, okay, go over to Malachi 1, and I'll get you to read that least Malachi 1 and verse 11. Malachi 1 and verse 11. I know I got you thumbing through all the Old Testament books, but Malachi 1 and verse 11. And then Henry, I'll get you to read verse 14 of that same chapter.
Verse one.
Verse 11.
So
For from
Malachi
the
1
rising
verse
of the
11.
sun even to its going down, my name great among the Gentiles. In every place incense shall be offered to my name, and a pure offering for my name shall be great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts.
In verse 14.
11 and 14.
Oh, and?
Did you want 11 and 14?
Yeah. But Henry can read verse 14, yeah.
But cursed is the deceiver, who has in his flock a male, and taken a vow, a sacrifice to the Lord, but is blemished. For I am a great king, says the Lord of the hosts, and my name is a fear among the nations.
Okay, in both these verses, my point here was Christ's deity, being God. Both these verses elevate him to greater than all. The Lord of hosts has put him in that position. And the angel Gabriel told Mary, remember Mary was the earthly mother of Jesus. If you look over in Luke chapter 1, in verses 32 and 33. Luke 1, 32, verse 32. Okay, Terry.
He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord of the throne of his father David, and he will reign over his house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be
Okay, did you get 33 too? Did you? Okay. Sometimes, we've said before, when we're trying to make points, 1 or 2 verses is fine, but with just here, the fact that so many say, well, Christ was a good man, and they respect him for that, but they strip him of his deity, which makes him nothing, because they're saying that this good man lied, because he said he was the Son of God. So how can he be a good man if he's saying what he isn't? Lord?
Well, our hope is based on him being who he says he was. And for those who don't believe that he was who he said he was, what faith and hope do they have?
Well, of course, right.
They have no hope.
Well,
Because,
exactly.
you know.
Well, they fool themselves. But what I was trying to do here was just, we have ample verses from the Old Testament, the prophecies, and the Pharisees and Sadducees and the Jews. They knew of these verses, and these verses all plainly say who Christ was. Claiming his, and it, the angel said to Mary here, the point I just wanted out of there was that he shall be great. So there is none greater. God's pointed out great men, but there is none greater than Christ. And I guess along with what Gord was saying, and our trust is in him, not in other men. I don't know if there's any other comments on that. Well, we'll move along. What did I have this slide in here for?
Bethlehem.
Oh, that was Bethlehem of Right, and the other one was up in, well, we don't have the tribes marked on there. I think it was north of Galilee, I think.
And it's about there.
Yeah, around there, I just forget now, but we made that point.
Like I said, that is a good point though to make, because there are some, Bethlehem I think is in Galilee. And so they come along and say, well, Jesus was a Galilean. And
Oh, right.
so they'll come along and say, well, he must have been born in Galilee. But the point is, when you read the stories in Matthew chapter 2 about the wise men coming, they wouldn't, if they were coming from the east, they get to Jerusalem. Bethlehem's only 8 kilometers out of Jerusalem.
Right,
And they had to leave another way to avoid Herod. They were all the way up in Galilee. They wouldn't have to worry about Herod, because
Right.
he's down in Jerusalem. And so it's very easy, just go up and around the Sea of Galilee, and you don't even have to worry about going to Herod. That, of course, like as far as, if you go back to Genesis 35, Rachel died on the road to Ephrath, which is the road to Bethlehem.
right,
Genesis 35 identifies that. And so, like as far as, it's very easy to know where this Bethlehem was.
right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. I never thought of that also. But we had made the point that Micah makes the point,
Yeah.
Bethlehem.
Well, and that's why Rachel, the prophecy of Rachel, weeping over her children, that's why that connects
Right.
like as far as what, because Ramah is up around there too.
Right,
And so that's why Rachel's connected in those prophecies, because she died on that road. And so that connects it all together. But you're right, no, as far as Micah identifies which Bethlehem, and it's not Nazareth.
right. Clears up any confusion, doesn't it? Well, we move into the content of Micah, and we're asked here to describe the sins of God's people. This isn't the sins of Assyria or anything. This is God's people that we read in the following passages. So we go over to Micah 1 and verse 7. Micah 1 and verse 7. Tim, I'll give you that. And Sandy, you can grab Micah 2 verses 1 and 2. So look at Micah 1 and verse 7.
All her carved image shall be beaten to pieces, and all her face as a harlot shall be burned with the fire. All her idols I will make desolate. For she gathered it from the pay of the Pharaoh. Then they shall return to the pay of the harlot.
Okay. In Tim's verse, what do we see here? Remember, these are God's people that Mike is speaking of. This-
Idolatry.
Right, right, idolatry. These graven images were the object of her trust, of Israel's trust, of Judah's trust, and adoration. They were praising them more than the God of the God of heaven and the earth. And they're told there what's going to happen to them. They're going to be beaten to pieces, to powder. They're going to be destroyed, Micah is saying.
I like the comparison. You're cheating on God when you're worshiping other idols. It's a harlot. Like as far as we often think, okay, adultery is cheating on your wife. Well, the Israelites were married to God,
Right.
and they're cheating on God by worshiping these other gods. And so that's the
right.
imagery Mike is giving.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, the harlots would take the money and that they were making, give it back to the priests also. Like the religion was tied in with that, which, as Jeremy was saying, that's like disgraceful. It's surprising that the Lord would even offer repentance to them. And then chapter 2, Sandy, chapter 2, the verses 1 and 2.
Woe to those who devise iniquity, and work out evil, on which they beg. And multiply their purchase, because it is in the power of their hand. They cover fields, and pay them by violence, also houses, and seize them. So they oppress a man and his houses, a man and his inheritance.
Okay, what sin kind of sums up the thoughts here on the, as far as the wealthy class go? Those,
They trample on God's authority that they take because they have the power to just take what they want.
right, Gord, right.
It's kind of what happens in today's society too. The wealthy get away with everything that the little guy wouldn't get away with.
Oh, I know. So much that we've read in these minor prophets is so applicable to the day and age that we live in. You know, we don't maybe see some of the cruel dealings in war as well. We do in a sense, but some of it's pretty perverted. But this idea, I had put down just covetousness. Like Gord says, that the wealthy have the power to oppress. And what's even more amazing here is that it's planned and deliberate. And this was God's people. Okay, we got to remind ourselves of this. And chapter 2, down to verses 8 and 9 is kind of along the same ideas maybe, but Micah 2, 8 and 9. Jeremy, I'll get you to read that, please.
Lately my people have risen up as an enemy. Pull off the robe with the garment for those who trust you as they pass by, like men returned from war. The women of my people you cast out from their pleasant houses, from their children you have taken away my glory forever.
Okay, and maybe going along with our last verses, what do we see here? We see something similar to the last verses, but then there is something that comes out here. We see the oppression of the poor again, but what do we see about those who will walk uprightly? Those who will be God-fearing, walk as they should. What do they become? Do you think? Do you think they become targets of the violent? You know, they're not left alone. They may endure more punishment. They become a greater target of the rich. And verses 10 and 11 of chapter 3, Naomi, 3, 10 and 11.
Who built Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. Its heads give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach for a price. Its prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord in the midst of us? No disaster shall come upon us.
Okay. Now we just read about the oppression that the wealthy were putting on the poor. What do we see here? What do we see here?
Corruption.
We still see corruption, don't we? And injustice, but on whose part now?
The priests.
Who go-
Judges.
Right, the priests, the leaders, the rulers. You know, how sad is that? That they judge for bribes. That's something we see quite common in our day. And the priests are teaching for money rather than teaching for the love of the truth.
So Jeremy needs a pay cut.
Well, I don't know if he's teaching for the love of money.
But no, preachers are worthy of their food, of course, because they're taught that.
Yeah, well, we see that today, don't we?
But I think in the olden days, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Levites were supported by the other tribes for their duty for serving God for them, being the priesthood.
Right.
It wasn't for money, they were supported.
Well,
So
yes.
they didn't lack food, clothing, shelter. It was provided by the other tribes.
Right, right. But here too, it's pointing out the priests and the leaders.
That's greed though.
Yeah,
These verses are talking about being greedy.
right.
And you pull it to the time of Jesus, Sadducees, which were a lot of the priests, were some of the richest people in all of Israel, because they were greedy. It's not that they needed that it was wrong for them to have money, but they were greedy of it, and they sought it. And so, yeah, that's always it's true of anyone.
Right.
But it's true of anyone that we need to be careful that our goal is not always needing more. We're being content with what we have. And if God blesses us with wealth, great. But if He doesn't, we can be content with what we have
Right,
and not be greedy.
right. And in these passages and all these prophets, God never condemns the honest working men, the honest business people. There was all kinds of business people back in this time. Think of Lydia and you know, none of those are condemned for what they were doing honestly, but what we see here through all of this is those that are being dishonest in their dealings with the common people. And verse 10 and 11, oh, we just read that. Didn't we? Yeah, the dishonest business practices I had wanted to point out that too. In chapter 6, and in chapter 6, right. Chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. Was it you, Naomi? No? Who read last?
Oh, that was me.
Was it?
Yes.
Tammy?
It's her turn.
Oh,
Did you
sorry.
read? You already read it? Okay.
I'm confused, you guys.
Are there yet the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the short means that is an abomination? Shall I count pure those with the wicked scales, and with the bag of deceitful weights?
Okay, what sin do we see here? Again, this is people of God. What do we see them practicing here?
They're being dishonest in their business.
Right, right. They're dishonest, it points out their scales, things would be bought by weight. Remember I pointed out a while ago, I forget where I had read it, what commentary, but in those days they had stones, and those stones would be a specific weight, and they would use that as their counterbalance when they were selling their grain. Well, they would use the wrong stones, the heavier stones.
Even today, you might have, if you're not using an electronic scale, which most people are anyway, but we can take it to an electronic scale. If you don't calibrate it properly, the electronic scales need to be calibrated so that you start at zero. And so you're not coming along and saying, well, this weighs 10 pounds where it only weighs 9.5 pounds. You're getting charged more money. And so when they had these weights, they said, okay, this is what a pound weighs, or a talent weighs, like as far as, and they would cheat it.
Right.
And they say this, when it really didn't weigh that. It would either weigh more or less, depending on whether they wanted, which way they wanted to go, and they needed, God said you must have honest weights.
Right.
You must have honest weights.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we see that in our days. To me, it seems like our packaging is all getting bigger. What's in the packaging is smaller, and our prices are higher. You know, dishonesty and businesses everywhere. And verse 16, we see something here. Kala, I'll get you to read that. Chapter 6, verse 16.
The statutes of Omri and all the works of the house of Ahab are observed, and in their devices you walk. Therefore I will give you up for destruction, and your inhabitants for derision, and you will bear the reproach of my people.
Okay, what sin do we see here? Remember, we're speaking to God's people. And who were they willing to follow here?
They're following the evil kings of Israel. Ahab and the house of Omri were one of the most wicked dynasties that Israel had.
Right,
And they were following after them.
right, Jeremy, right. It says they were walking in their counsels. And they were doing that rather than the law of God, rather than following God. And chapter 7, verses 5 and 6. Gordon, please.
Put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt, the daughter rises up against the mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house.
Okay, so what do we see in verse 5? There were those that trusted in the kings. And here, in verse 5, we see, they're trusting in their friends or companions. But what about verse 6? What do we see there that's...
You can't trust anyone, friend or family.
Yeah, it sums it up. Can't trust anyone, yeah. Dishonorable treatment of family members. These are God's people.
I find it interesting, Jesus quoted this in Matthew 10. Are
Right.
you going there?
No.
Okay.
No.
I find it interesting, Jesus, when he quoted this, I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. Jesus takes, Micah wasn't saying this in
No.
Micah, but he does take a thought from Micah and bring it forward to him.
Right.
He says, I'm going to do this. What I'm doing is not evil. What they did was evil. What I'm doing is not evil because because people need to follow me, and that was Matthew 10,
Right.
verses 35 and 36.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, here we see if the ones that do not trust in a friend, put your confidence in a companion. If they'd have been doing that, like trusting God over their friends, then their conflict in the families would have been justified because they were following God over what friends and others were saying. But we see here that the corruption in everyone. I guess you could almost say they were all a law unto themselves, each one of them. The Lord has his own law, I have my own law. If that interferes between us, so be it then. I dishonor him, he dishonors me. And yet, what we see here in our question was, these were supposed to be God's people. A far cry from what God would have them do. So we'll move along from there then, and the next section in our content was now God's case against his people. And Micah, in his prophecy, he doesn't waste any time in getting into his message, does he? God has spoken to him and warned him that the sins of the people, as we were just reading, are so great. They're just so unbelievable that he must send judgment now. And so it comes in the form of a lawsuit against his people. And something that they would understand, because they use the laws dishonestly. Whether that first bell is gone, maybe we'll look at question 7 then to begin next week. And Micah uses some language that indicates that God is bringing a lawsuit against his people. We see that, I think, one of Jeremy's sermons, and I just forget which one, but God helps us to understand by using things that we understand and know. And now here Micah is setting us in a courtroom scene with God as the judge, and he lays out his lawsuit against his people.
I'm not ashamed to